Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Providend's Money Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Isaac, Associate Advisor at Providend. Join with me today is Christopher Tan, CEO and founder of Providend. CEO, founder and co-host of this podcast as well. Hi Chris.
Hello.
Yeah, so I added one more to your title.
I was waiting for you to say we have a very special guest because you say that all the time. So the guest, I guess I'm not very special after all.
I wouldn't say that. It's just because you have been on this podcast
so many times.
Yeah, so many times, and you're also the co-host.
Okay.
So today's episode will be end of life planning. So before we begin, could you explain what end of life planning encompasses?
Okay. It's a very morbid subject. So we got to speak like it's very morbid.
Oh, so we have to be more solemn.
Okay, I'm just kidding. Okay, so end of life. I think there are different agencies that define end of life differently. Some people, they define end of life as all the planning that has got to do with death, right? So It'll be like mental incapacity planning, advanced care planning, Advance Medical Directive, and then some people include estate planning, writing a will, trust planning, and even funeral planning as part of end of life. But at Providend, I think we define it just slightly differently. So there are three parts to this whole, I won't call end of life. There are three parts to this whole planning concerning our bad health and also concerning about death. So the first part is really end of life, right? And in that regard, end of life, we are talking about mental incapacity planning, which we use the instrument, the lasting power of attorney. Right. And then the second area is advanced care planning. And then the third area is Advance Medical Directive, which is an instrument that is used as well when a person is defined as terminally ill. So these three areas of planning, we call it end of life here at Providend, right? And then the second part of planning, which is nearer death now, is estate planning, as well as legacy planning, right? Estate planning is really about planning one's assets upon a person's demise. So it's about estate creation, it's about estate preservation, and it's about estate distribution. And you can use various instruments such as a will and a trust for distribution. And then there's a third part that we don't really talk a lot about, which is what happened after death, right? And that would include estate administration, trust administration. So at Providend, we look at it quite separately. And when we work with our clients, we are involved in these three areas of planning.
Right. So how Providend defines it, end of life planning, we just segregate it out. So it's just mainly ACP, advanced care planning, lasting power of attorney, LPA, and advanced medical directive.
Yeah. So in the layman term, the way we separate it is, the first area is when you're about to die. The second area is when you're dead. Then the third area is what happened after the death. Yeah, I'm trying to make light of the topic because, like I say, this is quite morbid. Yeah. But having said so, these are the three important areas to plan.
Right. So let's start with Advanced Medical Directive, AMD. So modern medical technology allows us to use extraordinary measures to prolong life in the final stage of a terminal illness. However, it typically can't stop the final outcome. So as such, a decision has to be made whether to continue with the futile medical intervention. So Chris, could you explain more in depth of what AMD is and how does AMD come into play for this scenario?
Yeah, Isaac, like you said, right? We will all die one day. We can't really control when we're going to die most times. Sometimes people can, unfortunately. They commit suicide. But for most of us, we cannot control when we're going to die. But we can at least try and mitigate as much as possible the downside of how we will pass away. Right? So when a person is terminally ill and unconscious, the keyword here also, one of the keywords is unconscious, right? Because one can be terminally ill, and usually terminally ill means that a person is likely going to die in the next 12 months. And perhaps the medical profession will define even more in a more granular way. But it simply means a person is going to die very soon, right? And a person is unconscious and is unable to make decisions and speak for himself. By making an AMD, what you are telling the medical team is that you do not want any life support. Yeah, you rather let it, you rather go naturally. Yeah, so if you do an AMD, that's what you are communicating to the medical team. Now, of course, like I say, how you define terminally ill, I say it so simply, like, it's quite imminent that a person is going to pass away soon, like 12 months and all that. But I know the doctors, they have a stricter definition. I also know that for the medical team to put down, on a document that a person is terminally ill, it is a process, right? They need a team of 3 doctors. The first doctor would be the hospital doctor attending to you, and then 2 other doctors must be a specialist, and the 3 of them must assess the situation and say, okay, this patient is terminally ill before the AMD can take effect. And if the 3 doctors cannot confirm that for whatever reason, there may be a need to go into a second panel. So in Singapore, it's actually quite strict before the medical team will say that a person is terminally ill.
Right. So they cannot just, if let's say they diagnose you with a terminal illness, it's something that has gone through many levels of screening and checks.
Yeah, it's just not so simple to say that a person is terminally ill and then the AMD has to be executed. Remember, the AMD is about removing all life support. It's quite a serious decision. Right? I mean, you don't want to pull away life support
when there's a chance.
When there's a chance that a person may recover, right? Yeah, so for us as a layman, of course, we are not doctors. We may understand it not as deeply, but for the medical profession, they actually have a very stringent process before the doctors would sign on a paper and say, yes, this patient unfortunately is terminally ill, and then they look at whether this person will have an AMD, and then the AMD is executed.
Right. So without an AMD, they will just keep you on life support all the way, and as doctors, they always try to, or rather they are, can I say, obligated to keep you alive as long as possible?
I think without the AMD, the family has to say, right? So the doctors will, of course, tell the family that, this is the situation of the patient, we can put him on life support. And I know of many families who has done so. I've got a friend, the father suddenly had a stroke and then went to coma and was on life support for many months. So the family actually has a say to say, okay, life support, right? But clearly the doctor has said that there is very little chance of the father recovering. But the family continued to put them on life support, and the medical bills went up sky high. From what I have heard, not verified, that's what I was told, they were in a private hospital, and the medical bills came up to about $1 million. Right? I mean, how long can they sustain that? I mean, even if you got life insurance, there would be those limits, right?
Yeah.
So, but you see, the important thing is the family had a say, right? But had the father put in place an Advance Medical Directive, and if that condition was really terminal and he was unconscious, so he cannot say, then it's quite likely that the life support will be taken away from the father. Is it good? I don't know. It really, really depends on the situation. And that's why usually I'll tell clients that if you want to consider AMD, please discuss it with your family, right? Because you may think, I'm doing my family a favor. I don't want to burden them, especially with huge medical bills. But then you may not know that your family, they want to have that hope that you will turn around. I mean, we have heard stories of miracles happening, right?
Yeah.
People seemingly no more chance of surviving, but then they turn around, right? So some families, they may want to have that option, and sometimes you cannot assume. So I usually say, discuss that at the family. I know it's, in a way you have your quote unquote right, but you may want to discuss this with your family because it is really a very important decision.
Right. In that case, how do we make an AMD? Like, what's the process like? What's the cost like?
Yeah, so simply put, right, I mean, a person who wants to make an AMD must be 21 years and above, a major. Of course, he must be mentally sound, right? And the important thing about the AMD is that there must be 2 witnesses signing the AMD form. I think it's AMD Form 1. There are 3 forms. 2 witnesses, one of them must be a doctor. So the way to do it is to go to your family doctor and discuss with your family doctor and say, look, I want to do an Advance Medical Directive. Right. The clinic should have the form. But if you want to be sure, you can always download the form from the internet and bring the form along. And once the doctor has sort of like brief you, tell you the implications, and ascertain that you are mentally sound, then you can sign the AMD. So one of the witnesses would have to be the doctor, and then you need a second witness. It's better to bring your own second witness, right? Because you can't assume that the clinic's nurses or the clinic administrator would be willing to be your witness, right? So you might want to bring along your second witness. But if your second witness that you bring has got vested interest, meaning to say maybe he or she is a beneficiary of your estate, right? Yeah, then it becomes a bit complicated. So it's better to actually bring someone that will not have vested interest.
Right, that's a good point. Like you know, if you didn't mention that, maybe people will bring their spouse or their
quite
children.
Normally, right?
Yeah.
They'll bring their spouse, right? But again, quite naturally, your spouse will be a beneficiary of the estate. So it's better to bring someone that has got no vested interest. Then once that AMD document is signed, you seal that document and you send it to the registrar of AMD. You can find the address on the Ministry of Health website.
Right. Okay, thanks, Chris. So let's move on to lasting power of attorney, LPA. So what is an LPA? And what considerations should we give when choosing our donee?
Yeah, so the LPA is a legal document, right? Like the AMD. The AMD is also a legal document. So the LPA is a legal document. I mean, it came from the Mental Capacity Act. The best way to die is we sleep and then we wake up, open our eyes, and we see angels flying around. That's the best way to die, right? We got to heaven straight. But unfortunately, many of us may not go through that route. Many of us may be ill first before we passed away. And if a certain illness caused us to lose our mental capacity such that we cannot make decisions anymore, or dementia, and we cannot remember things and we cannot make decisions anymore, we may need to appoint someone to take care of us, not just in terms of our financial matters, but also in terms of our personal welfare matters. The LPA, lasting power of attorney, the document allows us to do that. So basically, we can appoint donee or donees, and these are the people whom we trust to be able to make these important decisions for us when we are unable to do so.
Right. So what aspects of my life can a donee make a decision for me? In terms of, is it my finances or health?
Yeah, so there'll be financial decisions that sometimes you have to make. I mean, like going to the bank and draw out money. And then maybe even, for example, you have got certain insurance forms that you need to sign. Maybe even going to LTA, to make some decisions with regard to your vehicle, your transport. So these are some of the decisions, right? And for example, in the case of my father-in-law was a hawker, right? And my father-in-law actually owned the store of that in a market that he operated in, and he sold vegetables, right? But at one point of his life, he was down with cancer, and it was so bad that he couldn't make any decisions anymore. But the store belonged to him, right? So somebody must make the decision to sign certain documents, right? Especially when document is to be signed to operate that store, right? So the donee can do that. So those are more, I would say, financial property matters, but there will be also be things like care preferences. Okay, and that is why usually we'll say that it'll be good to appoint the donee as the Advanced Care Planning ACP spokesman, which we're going to talk about, right? So that there's this coordination, because you're unable to talk about your care preferences, then the donee can make the decision for you as well. So it's a very important document to do.
Right. So what's the process like to nominate a donee in that case?
Yeah, so again, you can download the forms. There are two forms for LPA, right? The first one is LPA Form 1, right? The Form 1 is easier, right? Form 1 basically gives general powers to your donees, not very specific. That you can fill up the form yourself, and after you have filled up the form, you need to have a certificate issuer, which can either be a lawyer or a doctor, usually in the form of a psychiatrist, right, to be able to issue that certificate lah. Then of course you send that completed form to the office of the public guardian, right? So, but if you're going to do LPA Form 2, which gives more specific power to your donees, then you will need to go to a lawyer to do it.
Right. So let's move on to, just now you mentioned Advanced Care Planning, ACP. So the first two that we're talking about, LPA and AMD, they are legally binding, right? Could you explain what ACP is, and also, if it's not legally binding, and let's say I have an AMD and LPA already, should I still do an ACP? Why should I still do an ACP?
Yeah, so while the AMD and LPA, they are legal documents, ACP is not a legal document. ACP is a process, right? It's an advanced care planning process for someone while he is still mentally sound, still healthy, to be able to communicate his values with regard to his healthcare preferences to someone whom he or she trusts, right? And this person that he or she trusts is called the ACP spokesperson, right? And the ACP spokesperson will be able to speak out for this person in the event when he is ill and unable to share or discuss their care preferences with the medical team, right? So it doesn't mean that this person needs to be terminally ill, unlike the AMD, right? The AMD only kicks in when a person is terminally ill. But a patient may not be terminally ill, but just unable to talk about the kind of care that he wants, whether he wants all those invasive like tubes going through him and all that. So if you have done your ACP, you have someone to speak on behalf of you.
So for example, let's say I would prefer palliative care, for example. So that's where ACP is the one that I go to lah, in terms of...
That's right. So it's like I said, it's not a legal document, right? So yeah, you said it right, because again, in the case of my father-in-law, when my father-in-law was down with lung cancer, at home we can make a choice for him to say, no, we're going to bring him back. We're going to start palliative care back at home. And if he's to pass away, we know that he prefers to pass away at home rather than at the hospital. So these are things that through the ACP process, and whatever you discuss this with your ACP spokesperson, is actually documented in a ACP workbook. Now, it's a workbook. You can find this workbook on the internet. So it's not a document, right? The workbook basically guides the conversation for you to talk about your values, what is more important for you, and then finally dovetailing down to the kind of care that you want when you are sick.
Right. So as compared to AMD and LPA, I think this process will be we need a bit more work lah. So as you mentioned, for AMD, you have a doctor, you have a witness, and LPA, you can actually do it online now.
LPA, I think if I remember correctly, I think you can only do it online. Online LPA, and it's interesting you say that ACP needs a bit more work, right? And it's true, okay, because AMD and LPA, whilst they are legal document, I feel that it's easier to do, right? So you go to a lawyer and you get it done. You go to a doctor and you get it done.
It's quite rigid. There's not many.
I mean, it's everything is defined there, right? But the ACP, the hardest part about the ACP, who's going to initiate it? When are you going to initiate it? When are you going to do this? Most people won't think about this until they are sick, right? But actually, you should really do it when you are well,
right?
But who will initiate it? Would you, Isaac, go to your parents now and say, Ma, let's do an ACP?
Hopefully our listeners after this podcast.
Share the podcast with them and say, we need to start this process, right? But it's a very awkward thing, right? To tell your parents or your loved ones, that let's talk about ACP. And then to talk to your loved ones about actually what matters to you most.
It's not the easiest topic to bring up.
Not easy, right? So that whole conversation sometimes can be awkward. But I'll tell you personally, I've done ACP for my father. And it was very helpful, because when my father had multiple heart attacks before, and my father told us very clearly that if he has got one more heart attack, he doesn't want treatment. And we did it in the hospital. There was an ACP facilitator facilitating the conversation. So when my father had that final heart attack before he passed away, the siblings knew. My siblings knew. That was what dad wants. Right? Imagine that process was not put in place. Imagine if I had one of my siblings really wanting to save dad,
It caused quite a bit of dispute within the family.
Yeah, and then I can say, no, I have spoken to Pa before and I know he doesn't want. But nothing is documented. I'm not the appointed spokesperson. After my father passed away, I think there will be a lot of unhappiness. But because we have done it, the whole family, even before my father had a heart attack, everyone knew that that was what dad wanted. And so when dad passed away, no fights at all. We knew exactly that was what he wanted, and the decision was quite clear, right? So I think the ACP is actually, although difficult, although not legal, it is a very important conversation to have. In fact, I think the biggest benefit of the ACP is that conversation. You get to know your parents, you get to know your loved ones a lot better just simply through the conversation.
Right. And also, when you look at a workbook on ACP, it can be quite daunting in terms of the questions. But from my understanding, there is a facilitator right during the process of taking ACP.
Yeah. I mean, if a person is hospitalized already, there are ACP facilitators in the hospital. Just ask for it. But if you are well and you want to find an ACP facilitator, there are ACP notes they call it, that you can go and do it. Where to find them? I think the website, if I'm not wrong, is AIC.SG, if I'm not wrong. And so you can go there and find the notes and get somebody to help you facilitate that conversation.
Right. So touching on a point that you brought up just now, like when do we do it? So let's talk about end of life planning in general. Your ACP, AMD and LPA. At what age do you think we should start doing end of life planning?
Yeah. I think you should do it if your 21st birthday is yesterday.
Right.
Okay, joke aside, but that means that because like LPA and AMD, right, you can only do it, it's a legal document, you can only sign it when you are a major 21 years and above, so you can't do it when you are any younger. So as long as you're 21 years above, you can do your LPA, you can do your AMD, you should, because we never know when we are mentally incapacitated. I mean, we assume that life is like that. When we are young, we play, we study, then we get married, then we work, then we retire, then we die at 85. So about 84 we do . But unfortunately, life is not so certain.
Yeah.
The last 3 years of the pandemic has taught us that life is not certain. So you should do it as soon as you can. But practically speaking, Isaac, I know people only do it when they are frail, when they are not feeling too good.
It gets them start thinking about this kind of stuff, and usually it's almost if not too late already.
Yeah, so don't, because it becomes complicated, especially if you're frail and unwell, then the doctor has to ascertain that you really know what you're doing, So I would say that do it as soon as you can. And if you're listening to this and you are more senior, like you are in your 40s, well, I better be careful. When I say 40s, people listening to this and they say, you say I senior, they get very angry with me. Yeah, but okay, I'm 53, right? So I think we are at that age group whereby we should start thinking about these things. It's not just for ourselves. It's really for the people. It's to give clarity for the people who we love.
Right. So once I've done all these, how frequent should I review my end of life planning, or in what circumstance should I review?
I think when your thoughts change, right? So if I mean, there are many reasons why people can change their mind, right? Maybe because of advanced medical technology, you're now more convinced that actually there is a possible cure, right? So you say, okay, maybe I don't want AMD anymore, or maybe your loved ones convince you, or maybe for some people they have a religion that say, no, you can't do this. Okay, I'm just saying, I'm not sure, right? So you may change your mind. LPA, you may have to change it if you decide to change your donee, or your care preferences has changed. So when circumstances change, then you review it. Of course, for our clients who work with Providend, these are the questions that, regular progress meeting, we will likely go through with our clients to ask whether things have changed in life, right? And if things have changed in life, maybe they have to make changes. I'll give you a very specific example, right? So I have a client whom they have definitely done their ACP, but when they did the LPA, they realized that the donee and the ACP spokesperson, they are different, right? And now they prefer the donee to be the ACP spokesperson. So then they may have to go and sort of like redo the ACP process, okay? And
so there's more aligned and more in sync with each other lah.
That's right. I mean, you don't have to. It's just that if the ACP spokesperson and the donee is different, then what happens if the donee and the ACP spokesperson, they have a different idea, right? Or I have a client whom is now doing a trust, and every time when we talk about trust, we talk about the trust being triggered when a person passes away. But it may not always be the case, right? A trust can be triggered when a person loses mental incapacity. He can't manage his money anymore. And then the trustee will take over. And so you might want to align your LPA with your trust. So things like that, then you may have to make changes.
Yeah. So what other intangible benefits, let's say, are there for doing end-of-life planning? I mean, so for example, like not tarnishing your legacy with your children. I think I have a few friends that say they have a family member who is mentally not well anymore. And if let's say the past few years has been really, really bad for them, and then their perception of their parents change because of that lah.
Yeah, that's a very tough question, and I do not know how best to answer this. But I'll just say this. I mean, a lot of people think that legacy planning is like estate planning. I write a will, I distribute, but that's not legacy planning. Legacy planning takes your whole life. You build your legacy, and your parents leave behind the legacy for you throughout the life that they live. Not the last 1 year, not the last 2 years. Cannot be.
Yeah.
Right? Remember all the good things that let's say our parents, right, they have done for us since they were young, and they left a legacy, not just in terms of the financial legacy, but values. All these are legacy, right? So I'm not sure whether I can say, just because I didn't do my LPA, ACP, and then my family witnessed me dying in a very bad way, it tarnishes my legacy. Can't really say that. Okay, but I think the biggest benefit of doing all this end-of-life planning is that we go in a way whereby we think is most dignified. Yeah, because I've unfortunately witnessed many deaths in my family. And especially when they are very ill, it's not nice at all to watch, right? I have to help the caregiver change the diaper for my father-in-law. I'm not sure really that was what he wanted, right? And he's just there out in the open, and everybody can see the changing taking place, right? So one of the benefits of all this end-of-life planning is the dignity that I want for myself, right? And the second biggest benefit as a beneficiary of end-of-life planning is that family harmony. At the wake, at the funeral, we come together as a family. Of course, we grieve, but we celebrate the life of the people we love, not fight. I've seen families fighting, at the wake, and it's not just an ugly sight for the public to watch, but I cannot imagine the pain of the parents in the casket witnessing this, if he can witness this.
Yeah, that's the last thing that they usually want to see.
Yeah, so it's not nice, right? But it's so nice as a family to come together at the funeral. Yeah, we talk about parents, about loved ones. Yes, we grieve, we tear, but that's all part of process of healing. But most importantly, the siblings during the wake, they feel even closer to each other. Now that the parents are no longer around, they come together and say, no, we will continue this gathering together even though our parents are not around. And that can only happen if there is harmony. And end-of-life planning, one of the biggest benefit is that, because everyone is very clear. I know we're going to talk about estate planning, but that's also one of the biggest benefit of estate planning. I always tell clients that if you have done your estate planning, maybe you should even share with your family how you are distributing, so people know exactly why the parents distribute that way, and there is harmony. plenty of benefits. I mean, I can go on talking non-stop about end of life planning, but I really encourage you, if you're a listener, do consider doing it. Not when you are older, not when you are sick. Do it whenever you can. Take step by step. Do the easy thing first, right? I think like things like LPA is not difficult to do. AMD is not difficult to do.
Right. Okay. So thank you so much, Chris, like for your insights and in-depth knowledge and sharing our in-depth knowledge with all our listeners, especially on this topic that, to be honest, is not the most popular one in finance, but it's something that is very important. So that's all for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed our episode on end-of-life planning. If you like this episode, follow our podcast and follow us on social media for similar contents. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. All analysis, views or opinions from interviews, recommendations and other information broadcasted, or published herein are provided for general information purposes only. Information expressed does not take into account any specific situation, particular needs or objectives, and should not be construed as specific advice or a recommendation. Information has been obtained from sources that are deemed to be reliable, but their accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Always consult with a qualified investment, legal or tax professional before taking any action. Providend Limited does not accept any liability for any loss whatsoever arising from any use of the information broadcasted, or published herein. All contents and information contained herein may not be copied or reproduced in whole or in part by any means without prior written consent of Providend Limited.